The sanctuary was a place of second chances, a haven carved out of rolling pastures and sturdy wooden fences, where broken creatures came to heal. But even this refuge carried its own fragility. The family who ran it, the Harrisons, had poured everything into keeping it afloat. Bills piled up like storm clouds, and every month was a gamble to keep the lights on. The land itself seemed to echo their struggle, beautiful yet unforgiving, with its wild winds and encroaching woods. Animals roamed the grounds, some limping, some scarred, all bound by a shared story of abandonment or injury. For the Harrison family, this wasn't just a job, it was a promise, to protect what the world had cast aside. But promises weren't easy to keep when the world pressed in, and the sanctuary teetered on the edge of survival. The trailer door creaked open, revealing a shadow that barely resembled the proud animal Ranger must have once been. His gaunt body spoke of starvation, his matted coat stained with dirt and rust. Deep scars ran like rivers across his sides and legs, silent witnesses to the pain he had endured. Blindness clouded his once brilliant eyes, leaving only a milky haze. Ranger's head hung low as he hesitated at the threshold, nostrils flaring as unfamiliar scents filled the air. Every sound made him flinch, the clang of the gate, the rustle of hay. The Harrison family watched in silence. They had seen broken animals before, but there was something about Ranger that silenced even the hopeful whispers. He stepped forward, his hooves trembling as if each movement was an act of courage. This wasn't just another rescue, Ranger was a living testament to survival against impossible odds. Eva stood at the edge of the sanctuary, her cane tapping against the gravel. The world around her was a blur of sounds and textures, a far cry from the vibrant life she once knew before losing her sight. It had been months since she had ventured beyond her small, quiet routines. She had learned to navigate the darkness, but her heart remained shrouded in it. Her father had insisted she visit the sanctuary, a place he hoped would remind her of life's resilience. She didn't expect much. What could this place, filled with other broken beings, offer her that she didn't already have? Yet, as she stood there, the faint whinnies of horses and the earthy scent of hay stirred something unfamiliar. It wasn't quite hope, too faint for that, but a curiosity she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to wonder what lay ahead. Eva's first steps into the stable were tentative, her cane brushing against the straw-strewn floor. She paused near Ranger's stall, feeling a pull she couldn't explain. Inside, Ranger stood stiffly, his head tilted slightly as if sensing her presence. Eva reached out, her hand brushing the rough wood of the stall door. "Hey there," she murmured softly, her voice trembling with an emotion she couldn't name. Ranger snorted, stepping back, his muscles tense with mistrust. But he didn't bolt. He stood his ground, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. For a moment, they were two beings on opposite sides of a chasm, both unsure how to cross it. Yet in that fragile silence, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding born of shared pain. Later that evening, Eva made a decision. Despite Ranger's fear and her father's quiet skepticism, she would try. She didn't know why, but she felt it in her core, Ranger needed her as much as she needed him. As she placed a gentle hand on the stall door, her resolve solidified. This was just the beginning. Together, they would take the first step, however small, toward healing. Each day, Eva returned to Ranger's stall. She didn't push him, didn't demand his trust, she simply sat nearby and let him adjust to her presence. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the quiet stable, carrying words he couldn't understand but feelings he could sense. Sometimes she hummed softly, a melody that seemed to weave through the still air. Other times, she just described the world outside, the rustling leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft crunch of her footsteps on gravel. Ranger, ever watchful, kept his distance. But his ears flicked toward her voice, his body gradually losing its rigid stance. Weeks passed, and the tension in his frame softened. His hooves no longer shifted nervously when she arrived. The small, hesitant glances he cast her way felt like whispers of trust beginning to take root. Eva, patient and persistent, continued to show him that she wasn't there to hurt him. And Ranger, in his own cautious way, began to believe her. The day came like a fragile gift. Eva approached Ranger's stall as usual, her steps measured and deliberate. She paused at the door, waiting for him to acknowledge her. Ranger's ears twitched, his blind eyes scanning the air as if sensing her presence. Slowly, Eva extended her hand, palm open. She held it there, letting him choose. Ranger hesitated, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. But then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned forward. His nose brushed her hand, a fleeting touch, but one that spoke volumes. Encouraged, Eva reached toward his mane, her movements deliberate and slow. Her fingers grazed the tangled strands, and Ranger flinched but didn't pull away. She spoke softly, her words a steady rhythm as she worked her fingers through the knots. Each stroke of her hand seemed to calm him, the tension in his body easing with every moment. For the first time, Ranger stood still under a human's touch. It wasn't trust, not fully, but it was a step forward, a promise that maybe, just maybe, he could let his guard down. The sound came suddenly, a sharp clang of metal against stone. Ranger froze. His ears pinned back, and his body tensed like a coiled spring. Memories flooded in, unbidden and cruel, dragging him back to a place of fear and pain. He bolted to the far corner of the stall, his sides heaving as panic overtook him. His hooves scraped against the wooden floor, each movement frantic and wild. Eva, startled but calm, backed away, giving him space. She could feel the weight of his past, the invisible scars etched into his mind. Even as he calmed, the shadows lingered. Loud noises, sudden movements, even the faint scent of something unfamiliar, all were reminders of a life he was desperate to forget. But Eva refused to give up. She began to anticipate the triggers, moving carefully, ensuring the environment around him was as quiet and predictable as possible. Slowly, she worked to show Ranger that not all sounds meant danger, not all movements signaled harm. It was a slow, uphill battle, but Eva was determined. Eva sat on the edge of the stable, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Doubt crept into her mind like a cold wind, whispering questions she couldn't silence. Was she helping Ranger, or was she simply fooling herself? She replayed every misstep, every moment of hesitation. She thought of the times Ranger had recoiled, the fear that still lingered in his movements. Her own insecurities gnawed at her, each one a reminder of how much she had lost, her sight, her confidence, her sense of control. But amidst the doubts, a quiet resolve stirred. She thought of Ranger, his cautious steps toward trust, the way his ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He was trying, even when fear held him back. If he could push forward despite his past, couldn't she do the same? Eva clenched her fists, a newfound determination settling in her chest. She wasn't just fighting for Ranger, she was fighting for herself. She would prove, to both of them, that they could overcome their struggles together. The sanctuary's walls carried a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of hay or the low murmur of wind. The place, once a refuge for the wounded and lost, now teetered on the edge of despair. Donations had dwindled, debts piled up, and the once steady rhythm of care had begun to falter. Eva overheard hushed conversations, the weight of them pressing against her chest. Words like closure and auction were whispered, but they roared in her mind. Ranger's name surfaced more than once. A horse so scarred, so broken, was seen as a burden, not a blessing. Selling him could lighten the financial load, they said. But to Eva, the very thought was unbearable. Ranger had come so far. She had witnessed his transformation, however small, and she couldn't let him be reduced to a price tag. Her determination flared, fierce and unyielding. She spent hours working with him, her hands trembling with urgency as she brushed his mane or guided him through the paddock. She needed to prove his worth, not just to others, but to Ranger himself. The sanctuary's survival hung by a thread, but Eva resolved to fight. This place was more than just land and stables. It was hope, and Ranger was a part of that hope. If she had to fight the world to keep him here, then so be it. Eva's days were now a rhythm of persistence. Each morning, she stood by Ranger's side, her voice steady and calm. She guided him with gentle words, her tone a map for the horse who couldn't see. At first, his steps were hesitant, his body stiff with uncertainty. But Eva didn't falter. She introduced small exercises, leading him in slow circles, encouraging him to lift his hooves, or coaxing him toward the sound of her voice. Each tiny victory felt monumental. A soft nicker, a lowered head, a relaxed stance, all were signs of his growing trust. For Eva, these moments weren't just about Ranger. They were about her, too. She felt her own confidence returning, her steps more certain, her resolve unshaken. Ranger wasn't the only one learning to trust. She was learning, too, to trust her instincts, to trust her strength, to believe that they could find a way forward together. Their progress wasn't linear. There were days when Ranger balked, his fear rearing up like a storm. But Eva met those moments with patience, her voice steady even when her heart wavered. She knew that trust wasn't built in a day. It was a journey, one step at a time. As the days turned into weeks, something unspoken began to grow between Eva and Ranger. He no longer flinched at her touch. His ears perked at the sound of her approach, his body language softer, more open. And Eva, in turn, felt a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Ranger's resilience inspired her. Despite everything he'd endured, he kept moving forward, trusting her a little more each day. And in him, Eva saw her own reflection, a soul scarred but not broken, a heart searching for connection and purpose. They weren't just partners, they were mirrors, each drawing strength from the other. Where Eva wavered, Ranger steadied her. Where Ranger hesitated, Eva guided him. Together, they began to navigate their fears, their doubts, and the shadows of their pasts. Their bond was a quiet triumph, a testament to what could be achieved when two wounded souls chose to trust, to heal, and to move forward, together. The day turned dark without warning. Heavy clouds rolled in like an unstoppable tide, swallowing the sunlight in an instant. The first raindrops hit the sanctuary with a force that felt almost unnatural, followed by a deafening roar of thunder. Then came the wind, wild, relentless, tearing through the grounds and shaking the sanctuary to its core. The rain became a torrent, pooling into deep streams within minutes. Small puddles grew into rivers, swallowing the dirt paths and flooding the stalls. Water seeped into the barn, faster than the staff could bail it out. Flash flooding turned familiar corners into traps, sweeping away anything left unguarded. Staff shouted orders, their voices barely audible over the chaos. Animals whinnied, barked, bleated, and screeched in terror, their cries blending into a cacophony of panic. The storm was merciless, its fury unyielding, and every second felt like an eternity as the sanctuary fought to stay afloat, literally and figuratively. The animals reacted instinctively to the chaos, their survival instincts overpowering any sense of familiarity. Horses broke free from their ties, charging into the storm, their hooves splashing through rising water. Goats and smaller animals scrambled for higher ground, slipping and stumbling as the floodwaters rose around them. The staff raced from one enclosure to another, their boots sloshing through water as they tried to corral the frightened animals. Each effort was met with resistance, panicked creatures bolted in all directions, too overwhelmed to respond to calming hands. Time blurred into a frenzy of action. The sanctuary, once a place of order and refuge, had become a battlefield against nature's wrath. Every passing moment brought deeper water, louder thunder, and mounting fear. Eva clutched at the nearest solid object as the wind howled around her, stinging her face with cold rain. The world had turned into a gray blur, and she couldn't tell where the barn ended and the open field began. Her footing slipped, and she fell into the rushing water, scrambling to right herself. Her heart pounded as the storm swallowed every familiar landmark. The sound of the animals' cries pulled at her, but the roar of the storm drowned them out. Each step forward felt like a gamble, water tugged at her legs, the ground shifted beneath her feet, and the wind tore through her soaked clothes. Eva's thoughts raced. She couldn't see anyone. She couldn't hear anything but the storm. Fear clutched at her chest as she realized how alone she was. The sanctuary, her sanctuary, had turned into a labyrinth of danger. And she had no idea which way to go. Ranger stood trembling in his stall, his body rigid with fear as the storm's fury surrounded him. Water pooled around his hooves, and the sharp scent of wet wood and panic filled his senses. He couldn't see the chaos, but he felt it, the vibrations of hooves pounding the ground, the distant cries of animals in distress, and the storm's unrelenting roar. Then he felt something else, a pull, faint but insistent. Eva. The bond they'd formed was no longer just a comfort, it was a lifeline. Ranger's fear wavered as his instincts sharpened. Eva was out there. She needed him. With a sudden burst of strength, he kicked at the stall door. The old wood splintered under his hooves, and he stumbled into the open. The storm hit him like a wall, but he pushed forward. His ears swiveled, straining to catch any sound that might lead him to her. The ground was slick beneath his hooves, and every step was uncertain, but Ranger didn't falter. He moved with purpose, relying on the bond he shared with Eva to guide him. A distant cry, a voice, pierced through the storm. It was faint, barely audible, but it was enough. Ranger's body surged forward, his fear replaced by determination. Blindness didn't matter. Fear didn't matter. All that mattered was finding her. The storm raged on, but so did Ranger. Step by step, he followed that faint call, his heart pounding with the unshakable need to protect. Eva wasn't alone. Not anymore. The storm raged on, but Ranger's senses were sharp. He could feel the vibrations in the ground, the rush of water, the heavy stomp of hooves in the distance. He couldn't see, but he didn't need to. His bond with Eva had become more than just companionship, it was a lifeline. Eva's cry reached his ears, faint but clear. Without thinking, he moved toward it, trusting the rhythm of her voice to guide him. The floodwaters rushed higher, swallowing his hooves as the wind howled, pushing against him. His legs trembled, but he moved forward. Eva was out there. He could feel it in his chest. Every step was a battle, but Ranger kept going. He trusted his instincts, and the invisible thread that connected him to Eva. The storm's roar was deafening. His ears flicked back and forth, trying to pick up the smallest sound. A snap of branches. A shout. He pushed forward, head down, blind to the chaos, but following the pull of their bond. And then he heard her again, closer. Her voice had become louder, stronger, like a beacon in the storm. He was close. Eva had never needed to tell him what to do. The silent understanding between them was enough. With every step, they became more in sync, and soon, her figure appeared through the sheets of rain. The storm was still fierce, but Ranger's heart swelled with relief. He had found her. They were in this together, and they would survive together. Ranger's hooves slapped against the wet ground with a steady rhythm, each step taking him closer to safety. Eva's hand was on his neck now, guiding him, but it was his steady presence that kept her moving forward. Together, they reached the main building, familiar, solid. It was a beacon in the chaos, a place of refuge. Eva's grip on Ranger tightened as they crossed the threshold, the storm's fury crashing against the building as they were enveloped in warmth and shelter. Eva didn't let go. Her heart pounded, but it was a different kind of beat now. Relief washed over her. She was safe. They were safe. Ranger's soft breath echoed in the silence as the storm raged outside, but inside, the bond between them had solidified. Through fear, chaos, and uncertainty, they had survived. Together. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained. The sanctuary was still, the damage immense, but amidst the destruction, one thing stood clear: Ranger had proven his worth. Eva stood by his side, her hand resting gently on his mane. She looked at him, not with pity, but with respect. Ranger had guided her through the storm, not just with instinct, but with the unshakable trust they had built. He wasn't just a blind horse. He was a hero. The other staff, those who had witnessed the chaos, stood in awe of what Ranger had done. The bond between him and Eva was undeniable. It had saved them both. Ranger's heroism was not just in his actions, it was in the resilience he had shown when everything seemed lost. He had fought through fear, through blindness, through the storm. And in the end, he had led them both to safety. Eva knew then that Ranger wasn't just a part of the sanctuary, he was its heart. Ranger's journey had not been an easy one. His past was filled with scars, both physical and emotional, that he carried into his new life at the sanctuary. Yet, despite the pain, despite the hardships, he had shown the world something remarkable. He had survived, not just the storm, but the countless obstacles that came before it. And in doing so, he had become a symbol of resilience. When the storm had passed, and the waters had receded, the sanctuary was left in disarray. Staff members were devastated, unsure how they would continue after such destruction. But then they looked at Ranger. They saw the blind horse who had walked through the storm, never once giving up. His courage, his determination to find Eva, even when he couldn't see, became a beacon of hope for everyone around him. Ranger had faced the chaos with a strength they could all admire. As the days passed, Ranger's recovery was slow but steady. With each step, he showed more of his indomitable spirit. The wounds on his body healed, but his soul had already been transformed. The sanctuary staff, watching this quiet miracle unfold, began to find their own strength. They had seen how Ranger had continued, despite everything that tried to tear him down. And they, too, began to rebuild. Ranger had reminded them of something vital, the power of never giving up. The storm had shaken them, but it hadn't broken them. Ranger had taught them that there was always hope, even when it seemed lost. And, as they worked together to repair the sanctuary, the staff realized that they could rebuild, not just the walls of the sanctuary, but their spirits as well. The hope that Ranger had inspired was spreading, and the staff started to believe again. It was possible to fight for what they loved. It was possible to survive. Ranger's act of bravery didn't just change the lives of those at the sanctuary. News of his courage spread like wildfire. People from all over the town were inspired by his story. They had heard of the blind horse who had guided Eva through the storm, who had faced the impossible with nothing but his heart and the bond he shared with her. They were moved, and they wanted to help. Soon, donations began pouring in. Money, food, supplies, all given with the same hope that had been sparked by Ranger. Volunteers came, ready to pitch in and repair the damage left by the storm. The community rallied together in a way that no one had expected. They came together not just to save the sanctuary, but to preserve the spirit of hope that Ranger had ignited. Eva stood by, watching it all unfold, overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. The sanctuary, once on the verge of closing, was now alive with activity. People were working together, their actions driven by a shared belief in something larger than themselves. It was no longer just a place for animals. The sanctuary had become a symbol of unity, a place where kindness, compassion, and courage were at the forefront. Eva saw it more clearly now. Ranger had sparked a movement. His bravery had shown them all what was possible when they worked together. The sanctuary was more than a building, it was a community, a home, and, thanks to Ranger, it would survive. For Eva, the storm had changed everything. She had always known that Ranger was special, but it was during the chaos of the storm that she truly understood the depth of their connection. The bond they shared wasn't just one of survival, it was one of healing. Ranger had saved her life that day, but more importantly, he had shown her what it meant to help others. In the weeks that followed, Eva began to focus on a new mission. She had found a calling, one that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. She began to study therapy animals, learning about the profound effect animals like Ranger had on people's lives. She spent hours at the sanctuary, observing the way animals and humans interacted, how the animals' calm presence could ease pain and suffering. Every day, she spent more time with Ranger, strengthening their bond and using his recovery as a lesson. She could see it clearly now, the way he had guided her through the storm, not just physically, but emotionally. He had healed something deep within her, and now she wanted to help others do the same. She began to explore the idea of using animals to heal hearts, just as Ranger had healed hers. Eva knew that this was her path. The storm had stripped away everything she thought she knew about herself and the world, and in its place had come a new purpose, to help others, to show them that they could overcome their darkest moments. With Ranger by her side, she was ready to begin this new chapter, to share the lessons she had learned and offer hope to those who needed it most. As time passed, Eva and Ranger moved forward together. Their bond, forged in the chaos of the storm, had grown stronger. The challenges they had faced had changed them, but they had changed together. They had learned to rely on one another, to trust when everything else felt uncertain. Their friendship was no longer just about survival. It was about transformation. Ranger had shown Eva that even in the most hopeless of times, there was always a chance for change, for growth. Their bond had saved them both, and now, it was changing the lives of everyone around them. The sanctuary had been saved, not just by the community, but by Ranger's courage. The people who had once been afraid of losing it all were now working together to build something stronger, something more lasting. They had found hope in the most unexpected of places, in a blind horse who had refused to give up. And Eva had found a new calling. She was no longer just a girl trying to survive. She was a woman with a purpose. She was ready to help others find healing, just as she had. Together, Eva and Ranger would continue walking forward. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger. They had learned to trust one another, to believe in each other, and in the process, they had changed the world around them. Their story was just beginning, and it would inspire countless others to keep moving forward, no matter what came their way. Join Eva and Ranger's journey of courage, resilience, and hope. Don't miss out on their inspiring story. Subscribe now and be part of the change. Together, we can overcome any storm. Stay connected for more powerful stories of bravery and transformation.